You know how sometimes you wish you could just understand what makes different groups of people tick, maybe without going through endless surveys?
Yeah, definitely. Like getting a shortcut to understanding viewpoints.
Exactly. What if there was a way to get a peek into how various demographics might behave or, what they might prefer?
Well, that's really at the heart of the material you sent over, isn't it?
It is. It explores using AI, specifically these large language models or LLMs, to sort of simulate human behaviors, attitudes, even preferences,
Hmm.
all based on real world demographic info.
That's right. And the research, it's really looking at how well these AI agents can actually mirror the patterns and the tendencies we see in different populations.
So, for our listeners, our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack with this. What are the exciting possibilities? Where might things get a little shaky?
And ultimately, what does it all mean for how we sort of see the world around us? We need to look at both sides.
Precisely. We're diving into recent studies that look at when these AI simulations seem to get it right, achieving what some are calling algorithmic fidelity. That's where the AI's outputs line up with real world patterns in different subgroups.
But crucially, we also need to talk about the limitations, right? There are
Yeah.
potential pitfalls that researchers are starting to uncover
Yeah.
so people get the full picture.
Couldn't agree more.
So, okay, let's start with the promise then, this idea of algorithmic fidelity. What are researchers actually seeing when they try to get these AI models to, well, act like different demographic groups?
Well, a few key studies really jump out. Take Argyle and his team back in 2023. They used GPT-3 and they gave it these really detailed socio-demographic backstory.
Of like creating little digital profiles.
Kind of, yeah, like digital survey respondents with pretty rich backgrounds. And what they found was, well, quite remarkable, actually. The model's responses closely matched those of real human subgroups.
Matched how closely?
Well, they even found that GPT-3's simulated two-party vote shares for different demographics lined up surprisingly well with actual election results. That's what they mean by algorithmic fidelity, this detailed alignment based on demographics. What does that suggest to you?
Well, it suggests the models have absorbed something about societal patterns, right? It's not just random noise.
Exactly. And it's the level of detail that's interesting, not just general trends, but getting down to specific subgroups.
Okay, and this idea was pushed further, wasn't it, by Lee and colleagues in 2024?
Yes, that's right. They used GPT-4, so a newer model, to look at public opinion on a really complex issue, climate change.
Ah, okay. So moving beyond just voting.
Right. And they found that by giving the model demographic information, it could actually predict voting behaviors by subgroup pretty accurately.
So similar findings to Argyle, but on a different topic and model.
Yes, but here's where it gets really interesting and sort of a crucial point. The Lee study also found that for those more nuanced beliefs about climate change itself, demographics alone weren't quite enough.
Ah, okay. So just knowing age, location, that kind of thing,
Yeah.
it wasn't sufficient.
Apparently not for the really complex stuff. The AI needed more context to get closer to real-world responses. They even found a specific bias. GPT-4 seemed to underestimate the pro-climate opinions of Black Americans.
That's a key insight. So even when these models show impressive accuracy in some areas based on demographics, they might still need more substance to truly reflect complex human opinions. And they can even introduce their own biases.
Absolutely, which leads us to that Stanford digital twin study from 2024. This one's fascinating.
I remember reading about that one. What was the key finding there?
They created over 1,000 AI agents, but instead of just basic demographics, they used transcripts from 2-hour interviews with real people, real depth.
Wow, okay. So much richer input.
Exactly. And these agents achieved about 85% accuracy in reproducing those specific individual survey responses. That was significantly better than models that only had demographic info.
So what that really highlights is how important rich personal data can be for creating maybe more accurate simulations. Going beyond simple categories seems key.
It really suggests that.
And building on this, comparing different AI systems, there was the Zhang et al. Study from 2025. They looked at a whole range of LLMs, GPT-4, 3.5, Claude, even open source ones like Llama and Mistral.
Okay, and what did they uncover that's important for us? They used world values survey data, right?
They did. And what's interesting is they found these LLMs could generally generate plausible population-wide answers without specific training on that survey, often as accurate as machine learning models built just for that data.
So the models just sort of new general patterns already.
It seems that way. It reinforces the idea that these models have absorbed a lot of information about how demographics and opinions tend to correlate just from their general training data.
Okay, so overall, the picture seems to be that LLMs are actually quite capable of mirroring broad statistical tendencies. Things like generational differences, gender gaps, partisan splits.
That seems to be the general finding from this line of research, yes. They capture the big strokes surprisingly well, often.
Okay, so if they can do this, how exactly are researchers getting these AI agents to, well, act like specific demographic groups?
Yeah,
What are the main techniques?
right. Good question. There are a few main methods floating around. One common approach is using what they call persona prompts and backstories.
Okay, tell me more about that.
It's essentially where you tell the LLM who to be. You give it an age, gender, occupation, maybe political leaning, things like that. The Argyle study used this a lot with automated templates.
So you're basically giving the AI a character sheet to play.
Pretty much, yeah. And Bisbee and colleagues, they showed you could prompt ChatGPT to adopt different political personas, and its average ratings on social groups would align pretty closely with real survey data.
Interesting. So that's one way. What else?
Another technique is feeding the AI demographic variables directly as input. Think of that healthcare decision modeling study Zhang mentioned.
Right, the vaccine one.
Yeah. They gave the model a list of attributes, age, gender, race, income, along with a situation, and asked it to decide, like, would this person get a vaccine?
Ah, so it's more like feeding features into a predictive model almost.
Exactly. It's a more structured approach, perhaps less role-playing.
Got it. And you also mentioned fine-tuning and hybrid models.
Yes. So while many studies use these big off-the-shelf LLMs, some researchers are actually fine-tuning models on specific data sets, like using human responses from experiments to train the AI further.
Which could potentially make the AI even better at mimicking humans in that specific context.
That's the idea, yeah. And then finally, we have those rich persona embeddings like we talked about from the Stanford study.
Using the whole interview transcript.
Right, which goes way beyond basic demographics to capture much more detail about a person. And as we saw, seem to lead to higher individual accuracy.
It really feels like the more detailed and personal the input, the more nuanced and maybe accurate the output could be, at least for individuals.
It certainly points in that direction.
Okay, so they're creating these digital representations in various ways. But the big question, how do they know if these simulations are actually any good? How do you validate them?
That's critical, isn't it? There are several key ways researchers are trying to check. One is aggregate distribution matching.
Aggregate distribution. Okay, what's that?
Basically, you compare the overall statistics of the AI-generated data with real-world data. So did the AI produce, say, the same percentage of young adults supporting a policy as real surveys show?
Ah, comparing the overall totals and percentages.
Exactly. The Argyle study found high correlations using this method. And remember the 2012 election example. GPT-3 simulated the overall vote split pretty accurately. That's aggregate matching. It looks at whether the big picture lines up.
That does sound pretty compelling, especially for a real-world event like an election.
It is, but it's not the only check. Another method is crosstab and regression comparison.
Okay, that sounds more statistical.
It is. This looks at whether the relationships between different variables hold up in the AI's responses compared to real data.
So not just the totals, but how things relate to each other.
Precisely. Bisbee's work was important here. It highlighted that while the overall percentages might look right, the LLM could misestimate how demographics interact. Like the strength of the connection between age and a particular opinion might be off.
Ah, okay. So the overall numbers might seem correct, but the underlying reasons, the factors driving those opinions, might be misrepresented by the AI.
Exactly that. It's a crucial distinction. Then there's individual level accuracy, which we touched on with the Stanford study.
Right, seeing how well the AI matches one specific person's answers. Often compared to how consistent a real person is if you ask them twice, the test-retest reliability.
Exactly. And finally, there's something maybe softer. Human believability. Do people think the AI's answers sound plausible?
But you'd have to be careful with that one, right?
Absolutely. It's a useful check, maybe, but you wouldn't want it as your primary metric.
Yeah.
An AI could sound believable just by echoing common, maybe even harmful stereotypes about certain groups.
Right. Believable doesn't automatically equal accurate or unbiased.
Precise.
So, okay, even with these validation methods and some promising results, it definitely sounds like there are some significant limitations, potential distortions we really need to be aware of.
That's a very fair assessment. The research has definitely uncovered a number of, let's say, not so perfect aspects.
Like what are the main concerns?
Well, one big one is reduced variability, sometimes called oversmoothing.
Over smoothing.
Yeah. Bisbee's study, for example, found that ChatGPT's simulated respondents showed much less variation in their answers compared to real survey participants. The standard deviations were significantly different.
So the AI kind of pulls everyone towards the average, less diversity of opinion.
Exactly. Instead of seeing the full spectrum of opinions within a group, you might get a more narrow, sort of middle-of-the-road picture, which could definitely hide the true diversity of thought.
Yeah, that could be really misleading if you're trying to understand fringe opinions or just the range of views.
Definitely. And related to this is the issue of distorted relationships that we mentioned earlier from the regression comparisons.
Right, where the connections between factors might be wrong.
Yes. Even if the average opinions line up, the way different factors influence those opinions in the AI simulation might not match reality. This could lead you to draw incorrect conclusions about what actually drives people's views.
Okay, so the variability is reduced and the relationships between variables might be off. What else?
Well, there's the amplification of biases and this idea of caricature. Cheng and colleagues talked about this in 2023.
Caricature, like exaggerated portrayals.
Sort of. The idea is that models like GPT-4 can sometimes overgeneralize the personas you give them. They might create extreme or, like, one-dimensional portrayals of certain groups based on the prompt.
Ooh, so reinforcing stereotypes instead of reflecting reality.
That's the risk, yeah. It might create a response that seems like it fits the demographic, but is actually an exaggerated stereotypical version.
That sounds particularly dangerous. We need to be mindful of how these models represent groups.
Absolutely. We also see selective accuracy and gaps. Remember the Lee climate opinion study?
Yeah, where it struggled with
Yeah.
Black Americans' views specifically.
Exactly. That's an example where the model's accuracy wasn't uniform across all demographic groups. And the Zhang healthcare survey simulation also found different models could amplify or even attenuate certain disparities, like those based on race or income.
Wow. So the reliability might really vary depending on which group you're looking at and even which model you're using. That's crucial.
Definitely. The accuracy isn't guaranteed across the board. It's patchy.
Okay. Anything else on the distortion front?
One more big one, prompt sensitivity and reproducibility.
Ah, meaning how you ask the question matters.
Hugely. Bisbee and his team showed that even tiny changes in how you phrase the prompt could significantly alter the AI's output. What seems like a minor tweak could lead to very different results.
So consistency is a problem.
It can be. Plus, these models are constantly being updated by the companies that make them. So the same prompt given to GPT-4 today might yield different results than it did 6 months ago, or 6 months from now.
Wow. Okay. So the way you interact with the AI really influences the results, and the results themselves might not even be stable over time. That's a really significant consideration for reliability.
It absolutely is. It just underscores the need for extreme care in how these agents are used, and again, for thorough validation against real data every time.
Okay. So looking ahead then, given all this potential and these pitfalls, what are the maybe responsible uses of these AI agent simulations for someone trying to understand people better? And what needs to happen to make them more dependable?
Well, I think for researchers or even, policymakers, these simulations offer a really interesting potential. You can maybe quickly test ideas, explore how different policies or messages might be received by various demographic groups.
Sort of like a first pass check before you run a big, expensive survey.
Kind of like that, yeah. A preliminary way to gauge potential reactions or understand viewpoints.
Yeah.
But, and this is the huge, but it's absolutely vital to remember, they are not a substitute for real-world data.
Right. Handle with care.
Exactly. They require careful application, a clear understanding of all these limitations we've talked about. Looking forward, researchers are focused on better conditioning, meaning going beyond just basic demographics, trying to incorporate factors like ideology, personality traits, maybe even summaries of lived experiences to create more nuanced, more realistic agents.
That makes total sense. The richer the input, the better the potential output, like we saw with that Stanford study using the interview transcripts.
Exactly. And researchers are also working on ways to mitigate that caricature effect and other biases, things like using adversarial prompts to challenge the AI, or fine-tuning models specifically on diverse data sets to counteract stereotypes.
So actively trying to build less biased simulations.
That's the goal. There's also work on model and prompt selection, maybe choosing models or tuning them in ways that balance ethical constraints with fidelity. Interestingly, that Zhang study found that disabling content filters sometimes improved accuracy for minority groups, which raises its own tricky questions.
Yeah, that's a complex trade-off between safety and accuracy.
It is. And the final, absolutely crucial step is validation against ground truth. Always. Every AI simulation needs to be rigorously cross-referenced with real-world data. We need clear metrics, maybe like algorithmic fidelity scores, to measure just how closely the AI patterns match reality.
Okay. So boiling it all down, the key takeaway for our listeners is that these AI simulations are, well, a powerful and rapidly developing tool. They can offer valuable insights into demographic patterns, maybe some shortcuts.
But they come with really significant limitations. You have to be aware of the potential inaccuracies, the reduced variability, the risk of bias amplification.
And that crucial need for careful, constant validation against real-world information.
Exactly. These silicon samples, as some call them, can provide a glimpse, maybe a hypothesis generator, but they are absolutely not a perfect reflection of the messy, complex reality of human populations.
They're a tool, and like any tool, you have to understand how it works, its strengths, and maybe more importantly, its weaknesses.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Hmm.
Use thoughtfully.
So, thinking about all this, the incredible potential for insight on one hand, and the very real possibility of subtle, maybe even harmful, misrepresentation on the other, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How might this growing reliance on AI simulations shape how we understand ourselves and others in the future?
That's a big question.
And what responsibility do we all have, really, to make sure these tools are used ethically, carefully, and with a deep awareness of their limits? Definitely some food for thought there.
Step into the simulation, a virtual audience of role-playing characters, each with a unique perspective. This is more than playful fantasy. Welcome to Rally, a private crowd feedback platform designed to offer swift, authentic insights. Within these digital personas, you can pose nearly any question. Is your marketing pitch resonating? Does your design spark delight? Here you receive direct, honest feedback, free of the echo chamber and groupthink often found elsewhere. Marketers validate campaigns before launch. Innovators refine product concepts. Entrepreneurs test prototypes across broad or niche, specific digital audiences, all in a safe and private environment. Rally's simulated panel never tires and remains ready to guide you toward sharper, everyday decisions. By combining simplicity with insights from the crowd, Rally removes the barriers between your questions and your answers, all the wisdom, none of the scars.